Today, I'm going to be speaking with Amanda Montell, who's a linguist, also author of the book Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism, and co-host of the podcast Sounds Like a Cult. Amanda, great having you on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we've talked with cult experts sort of in the context of whether some of the followers of former President Trump are a cult. We've talked with cult experts about sort of like what pulls people into cults and how can you get people out of cults and the concept of like a deprogramming. And one of the things that always happens when we talk about it is I get emails from people saying, only certain people are susceptible to cults. It would never happen to me, which may be true, but there's this idea that there's something specific and some people, just like they can't be hypnotized, they would never be susceptible to a cult. Is that true? Is there something about the types of people that would even fall prey to cults?
Sure. Well, I was absolutely one of those people who thought I would never fall prey to a cult. I grew up with a cult survivor in the family. My dad was forced to join a cult called Synanon when he was a teenager. My parents are research scientists. I grew up in a home of skepticism and independent thinking. I thought never would I join a fanatical fringe group or fall prey to the charms of a charismatic guru. But then very quickly after researching this book, I found that the mythology surrounding the type of person who would join a cult, a word that really has no hard and fast definition, those stereotypes aren't exactly true. We tend to think of the sort of person who'd wind up in a cult like Heaven's Gate or the People's Temple, aka Jonestown, as someone desperate and disturbed, intellectually deficient. But first of all, why would a cult want someone like that? Why would they want someone who's liable to break down quickly? They want someone with an overabundance of idealism and with resources and privileges and connections and stars in their eyes, someone who believes that solutions to the world's most urgent problems are able to be found, and by affiliating with this group that they can be a part of that change. They want people who aren't going to quit after things invariably turn sour quite soon. So yeah, the cult survivors that I spoke to, survivors of everything from Jonestown to SoulCycle, they didn't fit this mold of the desperate cult follower. They were actually quite wise and service oriented.
You mentioned SoulCycle, which I think is interesting. Are cults necessarily bad in the sense of, I mean, some people might say like the Peloton world is sort of cultish, CrossFit
Right.
is another one, SoulCycle, etc. Are cults necessarily bad?
Sure. Well, this is why I decided to title the book Cultish, and it's why I often hedge my language when I talk about this wide spectrum of culty, cult-like, cultish groups.
Yeah.
Our reputation or the reputation that cults have as inherently sinister and nefarious is in large part shaped by the media coverage of major cult tragedies like Jonestown and the Manson family murders. Before those events, the word cult was not really on the mainstream cultural radar. And in fact, the earliest forms of this word didn't even have really negative meanings at all. The word evolved over time, exactly in line with how our culture evolved. So at this point, the word cult can really be used depending on the context to refer to everything from a group as deadly and destructive as QAnon to a widely followed wellness brand or SoulCycle. And that really reflects something about how fraught our culture's relationship is with ideas of community and spirituality and identity and meaning. But the definition of the word cult has so much to do with cultural normativity, what separates a cult from a religion, from another kind of socially accepted group.
Right.
Not all cults that have been called cults or could be called cults are inherently criminal or dangerous. So the word cult isn't really enough to identify what particular dangers are on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be interesting to hear a little more about evaluating maybe the parameters. Thinking back to the 2020 Democratic primary, I commented on there seems to be kind of a cult-ish thing happening around Andrew Yang, for example, who I like and is going to be on this show next week. I was a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but there was some cultishness if you looked on Reddit and Twitter around Bernie, certainly around this candidate named Tulsi Gabbard, who you may or may not be familiar with. What are the parameters we should sort of be looking at?
Sure. Well, In some contexts, certainly in this one, I don't find that it's always useful to strive to identify, oh, this is definitively a cult
Yeah,
and thus it is wildly dangerous. But
right.
yes, it's good to be aware of certain red flags, if you will, that can signify that something is cultish. And in the book, I outline what these red flags sound like rather than what they look like. You know, cult imagery often involves shaved heads and long robes, and sometimes a cult is actually a bunch of people in t-shirts or leggings, or it doesn't look like the cult we've been conditioned to see. So I outline many of these linguistic red flags in the book, and these can include super emotionally charged us versus them labels when everybody inside the group is uplifted with terminology that love bombs them, if you will, that makes them feel special and elite, while there are these, super loaded terms that lambast everybody on the outside as fundamentally inferior in a super black and white way. Even just the creation of a ton of specialized terminology can be a sign that something cultish is going on here. We all love the feeling of speaking a secret language, like Pig Latin on the playground. Who didn't love learning that and being able to talk in a way that other kids couldn't understand? It makes us feel like we're putting on a uniform, if you will, like we're doing something right, even if we're not saying anything that can't be said in plain English, even if we don't ourselves understand what we're saying exactly or couldn't define it for an outsider. That specialized terminology encourages conformity. It, in some cases, discourages independent thinking. And then there's this phrase that once you understand it, you won't be able to unhear it, that is often used in cultish groups. It's called a thought-terminating cliche. It's a linguistic technique that all cultish leaders from Jim Jones to Jeff Bezos use, and it describes a sort of stock expression that's easily memorized, easily repeated, and aimed at shutting down independent thinking or questioning. So thought-terminating cliches also show up in our everyday lives in the form of things like, well, it is what it is, or it's all in God's plan, boys will be boys. In QAnon, it might sound like trust the plan, or, well, I did my research. Of course, research to a QAnoner doesn't involve peer-reviewed studies, but those are some examples.
As I'm hearing you lay this out, my mind just can't get away from Jordan Peterson. And one of the I'm curious about another aspect, which is whenever I've made criticisms of Jordan Peterson in the past, a lot of the emails I get are, I am not accurately criticizing what he really is saying. That actually I'm only criticizing what I wrongly believe him to be saying, and that there really is no true criticism because what he's saying is different than what I'm saying, which is sort of indefeasible. Like if you're always going to tell me I'm misunderstanding what he's saying, but you're actually saying sometimes the difficulty of understanding what's being said is a feature and not a bug.
Right. Absolutely. To use sort of circular language, misleading euphemisms, that can be really disorienting. I would venture to think that some of his followers are confused some of the time, but they just have this sort of unquestioned worshiping of him. And yeah, that completely sounds like a form of a thought-terminating cliche. It sounds not unlike when New Agers or Keith Raniere, if those were familiar with NXIVM, would dismiss a valid doubt or concern as a limiting belief. Oh, that's just your mind limiting you from being able to understand.
Yeah, or that's a suppressive thought from the Church of Scientology, or there's a lot of
Exactly.
analogies to that. So
Yes.
in the world of changing people's minds, there's this idea that just giving people facts doesn't get them to change their minds. It often kind of makes them plant their feet in the sand or dig their head in the sand, whatever metaphor or analogy you want to use.
Yeah.
When it comes to getting someone out of a cult, particularly the more serious ones that are more dangerous, I guess we would say, what works and what doesn't work? It seems just saying you're in a cult is not likely to be very effective.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not a deprogrammer or a mental health counselor. This isn't my expertise, actually, like shaking people and snapping them out of it.
Yeah.
But yes, from talking to so many experts, what I can more easily say is what's not effective. As tempting as it is to look someone in the eye and tell them you're in a cult, you're brainwashed. Those things are not effective. That just works to alienate that person because, of course, they think that you're in a cult and you're brainwashed. Brainwashed is also really nothing but a metaphor, and is a term that's often used as a thought-terminating cliche in itself sometimes, just to write off someone as hopeless and mind-controlled. So as tempting as it is to use phrases like that, they're not super effective. And also, if you're talking to like a QAnon or an anti-vaxxer or a conspiritualist, if folks are familiar with that term, the portmanteau of conspiracy theory and spirituality, if you try to, unpack their logic by citing some of these more peer-reviewed studies or studies from an institution that they've been led to believe is fundamentally flawed or controlled by this evil cabal of elites,
Right.
they're going to feel fundamentally misunderstood by you. So if it feels like safe and healthy for you to keep this person in your life, I would say, have as much or as little of an outside influence on them as you can just by existing. Maybe use the Socratic method to poke holes in their logic via questions.
Yep.
But indeed, like, facts don't change people's minds. And so you just have to hope that they'll come to reality on their own and eventually come safely home.
In terms of the motivation or what can be appealing about being in cults or cultish groups, when we think about conspiracy theories, it seems one of the things that's often appealing to people is that the conspiracy theory is a simpler explanation that often points to more control over what happens in our lives rather than less, where like if there's random, unpredictable, horrible events, that can be a lot scarier than someone planned this thing and it's just like, this is the person that did it and we knew it was going to happen, they knew it was going to happen. It's just, that's what it is. Is there an aspect of that that applies to the attractiveness of cults?
Yeah, well, cults and conspiracy theories really go hand in hand because they create that us versus them binary and they do a lot of simplifying of logic and of rhetoric. But absolutely, I mean, cultishness and conspiratorial belief, these things tend to spike during times of cultural turbulence and turmoil. That's what we saw in the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, the Kennedy assassinations. People were feeling sort of existentially high and dry. And the reason why the United States, even though it's a developed country, is so religious compared to other nations that have, high life expectancies and high education levels is in part because we have so few safety nets, social safety nets that are there to catch us when we get sick or lose our jobs. We're left feeling very much all on our own in this culture. And so we end up mistrusting mainstream institutions and turning toward alternative groups for closure and answers and security. And some of those groups are relatively harmless or even positive, but there are a lot of people who are willing to step in and take advantage of people's vulnerabilities.
That's interesting. And so it seems that a lot of the same emotional circumstances and economic circumstances that we talk about in connection with so many different aspects of society point in this very same direction. It goes back to some of that underlying structure, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a reason why the United States and cultishness tend to have this pretty consistent relationship. We always have.
That's fascinating. The book is Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism. We've been speaking with author of the book, Amanda Montell, who also co-hosts the podcast Sounds Like a Cult. Amanda, really a pleasure having you on. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.